Welcome to the case of the disappearance of the seventh guest. I am your host, Holmes's friend, Dr. John Watson. Tonight's story is not one of a simple crime, but of a truth long buried, and a man who paid for the sins of others. A dinner was arranged, guests were invited, and yet one of them should never have been there. Before we begin, tell me, from which city are you watching, and what was the very first Sherlock Holmes story you ever heard? Now, let us return to Baker Street, where this most unsettling case began. Chapter 1, The Invitation, written in a familiar hand. It was the handwriting that troubled him, not the content of the letter, which was perfectly civil. A dinner invitation from one Sir Reginald Cathcart of Blackthorn House near Worthing in Sussex, requesting the pleasure of Mr. Sherlock Holmes's company for a weekend gathering of distinguished guests. The occasion, Sir Reginald wrote, was his annual collector's dinner, at which he displayed new acquisitions salvaged from the sea and entertained those who shared his passion for the drowned histories of the British Maritime Service. Holmes's reputation as a man of singular intellect had reached Sir Reginald through mutual acquaintance, and his presence would be a great honour. The letter was courteous. It was warm without being familiar. It struck precisely the tone that a man of culture and means would use when addressing someone he admired from a distance. And yet Holmes held it beneath the lamp for a full 3 minutes without speaking. And I'd been reading the evening papers in my chair, a review of a new surgical technique from Vienna that had caught my professional interest, and I noticed him only when the silence in the room grew heavy enough to intrude upon my concentration. Holmes stood at the mantelpiece with the letter angled toward the gaslight. His grey eyes narrowed not at the words themselves, but at the shapes of the letters, the pressure of the pen, the precise distance between each line. "A patient correspondent," I remarked, setting down the paper. "You've been staring at that letter as though it were written in cipher." "Not cipher," Holmes said quietly. "Something more unsettling than that." He handed it to me. I read it through. The stationery was heavy cream stock embossed with a small nautical crest. The ink was black and even. The hand itself was controlled and elegant, not the careless scrawl of a wealthy eccentric, but the deliberate penmanship of someone who had been trained to write with discipline and patience. "It seems a perfectly reasonable invitation," I said. "A collector's dinner, maritime relics, Sussex. Rather pleasant, I should think." "Read the third paragraph again." I did. Sir Reginald praised Holmes's devotion to justice, not to detection, not to deduction, not to the science of criminal investigation, but specifically and deliberately to justice. He expressed his conviction that Mr. Holmes was a man who believed that no truth, however deeply buried, should remain hidden from those who deserved to know it. An unusual compliment, I admitted. "It is not a compliment, Watson. It is a challenge." Holmes took the letter back and folded it with care. "This sentence was not written by a man who admires me. It was written by someone who is testing whether I believe my own reputation." He moved to the window and looked down into Baker Street. The evening traffic was thinning. A four-wheeler rattled past beneath the yellow haze of the street lamps. "There is something else," he continued, still facing the glass. "The handwriting. I have seen it before." "Where?" "That is exactly what disturbs me. I cannot remember." In the years I'd known Sherlock Holmes, I had seen him confounded by locked rooms, deceived by clever disguises, and on rare occasions outmanoeuvred by criminals of exceptional nerve. But I had almost never seen him troubled by his own memory. His mind was a cathedral of reference, vast, indexed, and ruthlessly maintained. For a piece of handwriting to sit within it without a label was, to Holmes, not a minor irritation, but a kind of disorder in the architecture of his thinking. He spent the remainder of that evening at his desk. He did not play the violin. He did not smoke. He pulled open the long drawers of his filing cabinet and removed folder after folder of correspondence, criminal, professional, personal, and compared each sample to the hand on Sir Reginald's letter. I watched him for a time, then retired to bed. When I came down the following morning, I found him in the same chair, still dressed, with the letter open on the desk before him, and a cold cup of coffee untouched at his elbow. Around him lay scattered envelopes and case documents spanning a decade of work. He had not slept. "Have you found it?" I asked. "No," he said, "but I've eliminated enough to know where to look. The hand is educated, female in origin, though deliberately steadied to appear masculine, and belongs to someone who once wrote with emotional urgency, but has since trained herself into control. The pressure of the pen is even throughout, which means the writer is not naturally calm, but has made calmness a discipline. A woman pretending to be Sir Reginald? Not pretending to be him, writing on his behalf. Perhaps at his instruction, perhaps not. But this hand did not learn its steadiness in a drawing room, Watson. It learned it the way one learns any difficult thing, through suffering, and through the decision not to let suffering be visible." He rose, stretched his long frame, and moved to the fireplace. "We shall accept the invitation. You suspect something? Then. I suspect everything. The guest list, the location, the phrasing, the timing. This letter does not read as an invitation. It reads as a summons." I began to protest that we had no evidence of anything amiss, that a collector's dinner in Sussex was hardly the stuff of criminal investigation, but Holmes silenced me with one of those sharp, quiet looks that meant he had already moved several steps beyond argument. "Consider this," he said. "A man I have never met invites me to a weekend gathering. He does not mention a single other guest by name. He praises not my intellect but my devotion to justice, a word I rarely use, and which clients almost never employ. And the letter itself is written in a hand I recognize but cannot place, which means it belongs not to a stranger but to someone connected to a case I once considered closed." He paused. "When a closed case begins to write to you, Watson, it is because you closed it incorrectly." That sentence stayed with me through the morning and through our preparations for travel. Holmes spoke little as we packed. He brought his revolver, which I noted but did not question. He had an instinct for danger that operated below the level of articulate reason, and I had long since learned to trust it. On the train from Victoria, Holmes sat by the window with the letter unfolded on his knee. He read it twice more, then folded it and placed it inside his breast pocket. "Watson," he said, as the suburbs gave way to the green roll of the Sussex Downs, "do you recall the Whitmore Maritime case?" "Vaguely. A pension fund fraud. Wasn't it? 4 or 5 years ago." 5 years, precisely. A shipping clerk named Daniel Ferris was convicted of embezzling the pension fund belonging to retired dock workers of the Whitmore Maritime Company. The evidence was clean, the conviction swift, and Ferris was sentenced to hard labour. I was satisfied with the result at the time. "And now?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He watched the countryside pass, the chalk hills, the hedgerows heavy with late summer growth, the distant grey line where land met sky. "Now I find myself wondering whether satisfaction and certainty are the same thing," he said. "I solved that case with what I believed was precision. The documents pointed to Ferris. The ledgers confirmed his access. The timeline aligned perfectly with his movements. It was, in fact, one of the neatest cases I've ever encountered. That troubles you?" "It troubles me now, yes. Because neatness is the hallmark of arrangement, Watson, and arrangement is the hallmark of design. A crime that solves too cleanly may not be a crime that was committed cleanly. It may be a crime that was cleaned." I felt the hairs on my forearm rise. Holmes was not given to self-doubt, and when he expressed it, the effect was more alarming than any criminal threat I had faced beside him. "Do you believe Ferris was innocent?" I asked. "No, I believe he was guilty. But guilt is not always complete, and conviction is not always just. A man may commit a crime and still be the least guilty person in the room." He said nothing more until we reached Worthing, where a carriage was waiting to take us the remaining miles to Blackthorn House. The driver was a quiet, broad-shouldered man who spoke only to confirm our names and destination. The road wound through low hills and dense copses of elm, and as we crested the final ridge, I caught my first glimpse of the house. Blackthorn House stood on a shallow rise above the coastal plain, a rambling Georgian structure of grey stone with tall windows that caught the fading light like blind eyes. It was grander than I had expected, and more melancholy, the kind of house that had once been magnificent and was now merely large, its gardens overgrown, its walls streaked with damp, its roofline faintly sagging at the eastern wing. But what struck me most was not the house itself. It was what stood in the front garden, mounted on a stone plinth beside the gravel drive, like a monument in a public square, was the salvaged figurehead of a ship, a carved woman with outstretched arms, her wooden face cracked by salt and weather, her painted eyes staring toward the sea she would never reach again. Holmes regarded it for a long moment as we stepped from the carriage. "A house of wreckage," he murmured. "How appropriate." The front door opened before we reached it. A woman stood in the entrance hall, tall, composed, dressed in the plain dark dress of a senior housekeeper. Her hair was drawn back tightly, her face was pale and angular, and her expression carried the particular stillness of someone who has decided, long ago, that her feelings are not for public display. "Mr. Holmes," she said. "Dr. Watson. Sir Reginald is in the West Gallery. I am Miss Graves, the housekeeper. I will show you to your rooms." Holmes thanked her and stepped inside. I followed, and as I passed her in the doorway I happened to glance down at her hands. They were not the hands of a woman who had spent her life in service. The fingers were fine and controlled, with faint ink stains along the edge of the right index finger, the mark of someone who wrote frequently, carefully, and at length. I said nothing, but I remembered. Miss Graves led us through a long corridor lined with glass cases. Inside each one lay objects recovered from the sea, a ship's compass with a cracked face, a logbook swollen with water damage, a brass telescope green with corrosion, fragments of ceramic and rope and nameplates from vessels I did not recognize. The air smelled of old wood and salt and something faintly chemical, preservative perhaps, or the slow decay of things that had been underwater too long. At the end of the corridor we passed a dining room, and I looked in. The table was laid for 9. I counted again to be sure. 9 place settings, 9 chairs, 9 glasses reflecting the candlelight like a row of small fires. "How many guests are expected?" I asked Miss Graves. 8, sir," she said, "including yourselves." "Then there is an extra setting." She paused. For a fraction of a moment something moved behind her eyes. Not surprise, not confusion, but something colder. Recognition. "I shall correct it at once," she said. Behind me, Holmes spoke quietly. "Leave it." Miss Graves turned to face him. Their eyes met. The silence between them lasted no more than 2 seconds, but in that silence I felt the entire weight of the evening shift, or as though the house itself had drawn a breath and was holding it. "As you wish, Mr. Holmes," she said, and she led us upstairs without another word. Chapter 2. Blackthorn House and the 9th Chair. Our rooms were on the first floor of the eastern wing, adjacent to one another, and overlooking a walled garden that had long since surrendered to neglect. The flower beds had gone to seed, and a stone bird bath stood cracked and dry at the centre of what must once have been a pleasant lawn. Beyond the garden wall the land fell away toward the coast, and through the open window I could hear the faint rhythmic collapse of waves against the chalk shore below. The room itself was comfortable enough, though it carried the same atmosphere of faded grandeur that pervaded the whole house. The wallpaper was a deep maritime blue, and peeling slightly at the corners. Above the bed hung a framed sea chart of the English Channel, dated 1843, marked with small red crosses at locations I assumed corresponded to shipwrecks. On the dresser, beside a porcelain washing basin, sat a glass case containing a corroded sextant whose brass had turned the colour of old bone. I unpacked my bag and changed my collar, then crossed the hall to Holmes's room. He had not unpacked at all. He stood at the window with his hands clasped behind his back, looking not at the garden, but at the interior of the room itself, reflected in the darkening glass. "What do you make of our host's decorating instincts?" he asked without turning. "Morbid," I said. "The whole house feels like a museum of disasters." "Precisely. Sir Reginald does not collect maritime artefacts in the usual sense. He does not collect triumphs, no models of famous warships, no paintings of naval victories. He collects wreckage, salvage, the remains of things that were lost and partially recovered. Every object in this house was pulled from a catastrophe." He turned from the window. "That is either the obsession of a melancholic eccentric, or it is the reason this particular house was chosen for this particular gathering. We shall see which." A gong sounded from somewhere below, and we descended together. The drawing-room occupied the southwestern corner of the ground floor, a large, high-ceilinged space with tall windows draped in heavy green velvet. A fire had been lit despite the mildness of the evening, and its light played across a room crowded with maritime curiosities. A ship's wheel mounted on the far wall, a case of tarnished medals, a painting of a lifeboat crew launching into a black and heaving sea. Above the fireplace hung the room's centerpiece, an enormous oil painting, darkened with age, of a three-masted vessel breaking apart in a storm. The ship was listing hard to port, its sails in tatters, and the sea around it was painted in such violent greens and blacks that the canvas itself seemed to churn. A small brass plate at the base of the frame read, "HMS Dolorosa, lost with all hands, 1867. Beneath this painting stood our host. Sir Reginald Cathcart was a man of perhaps 65, tall and thin, with the sort of face that had once been handsome and was now merely distinguished. His hair was white and swept back from a high forehead. His eyes were pale blue and carried a watery brightness that suggested either sentiment or drink. He wore an evening coat that was well cut but not new, and his cufflinks, I noticed because Holmes would later mention them, were fashioned from coins recovered from a Spanish wreck. "Mr. Holmes," he said, crossing the room with an outstretched hand. "Dr. Watson, what a pleasure, what a genuine pleasure. I have read every one of Dr. Watson's published accounts, and I must say, sir, you do not do yourself sufficient credit in them. You are always the steady hand in the background, but I suspect the hand does more than you let on." He was warm, voluble, and immediately likeable, the kind of man who filled silence with conversation because silence made him uncomfortable. He guided us toward the fire and pressed glasses of sherry into our hands before we had removed our gloves. And within 5 minutes I knew more about the provenance of the HMS Dolorosa painting than I had ever wished to learn. Holmes bore this with patience, asking the occasional question, not about the painting, but about the house. How long had Sir Reginald lived here? 12 years. Had it been in his family? No, purchased from the estate of a deceased admiral. And the collection, was it all his own acquisition? Every piece, Sir Reginald said proudly, salvaged by his own agents or purchased at auction from maritime recovery firms. "And the staff?" Holmes asked with no change in tone. "Have they been with you long?" "Most of them, yes. Old Jennings, the groundsman, has been here since before I arrived. Came with the house, one might say. Mrs. Poole in the kitchen, 10 years at least. The only recent addition is Miss Graves, my housekeeper. Took her on about 6 months ago, after the previous woman retired to live with her sister in Dorset." 6 months, Holmes repeated. "And how did you come to hire her?" She answered an advertisement. Impeccable references. Quiet, efficient, never a word out of place. Runs the household like a Swiss clock. I count myself fortunate. Holmes said nothing further on the subject, but I saw his fingers tighten fractionally on the stem of his glass. The other guests arrived in stages over the following half hour. Each entrance sharpened the atmosphere in the room by a degree that I could feel but not yet explain. The first was Mrs. Virginia Lockhart, a handsome woman of 50 in a dark violet evening dress. who carried herself with the practised composure of someone accustomed to charitable functions and public speaking. She greeted Sir Reginald with warmth, Holmes with polite interest, and me with the kind of generous smile that made you feel she was genuinely pleased to meet you. But when the next guest entered the room, I saw her smile falter, not vanish, but stiffen as though the muscles of her face had briefly received contradictory instructions. The cause of this was Leonard Cross, the solicitor. He was a spare, angular man of middle height, dressed with severe precision, who entered carrying a leather case that he placed beside his chair and did not release, even when Sir Reginald offered to have it taken to his room. His handshake was brief and dry. His eyes moved across the room with the flat efficiency of a man cataloguing evidence. When he saw Mrs. Lockhart, he gave a short nod, not of greeting, but of acknowledgement, as one might nod to a fellow passenger on a train one had taken many times before. They knew each other. They did not wish to show it. Captain James Whitfield arrived next, announced by the sharp report of his boots on the stone floor of the entrance hall. He was a broad, rigid man with a clipped grey moustache and the bearing of someone who had spent decades expecting to be obeyed. He surveyed the drawing-room as though inspecting a quarterdeck, accepted his sherry without thanks, and positioned himself near the fireplace with his back to the painting of the Dolorosa. When his eyes fell on Holmes, something cold moved through them. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "I had not expected to find you here." "Nor I you, Captain," Holmes replied evenly. I was not aware Sir Reginald's interests extended to criminal detection. "They extend to justice," Holmes said, or so his letter informed me. Whitfield held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, then turned away to examine a barometer mounted on the wall with an intensity that suggested he would rather study anything in the room than the man who had just spoken to him. Dr. Philip Hartwell arrived shortly after, a stout, grey-faced man with kind eyes and an apologetic manner, who shook hands with everyone and seemed grateful to be offered a chair. I liked him instinctively, as one medical man often does another, and we exchanged a few words about the journey from London. But as he reached for his glass, I noticed the tremor in his right hand. It was not the tremor of age or fatigue, but it was the tremor of chemical dependency, a faint rhythmic oscillation of the fingers that I'd seen in hospital wards and knew too well to mistake. He saw me notice. He withdrew his hand and placed it in his lap. The fifth guest was Miss Adeline Price, a woman of perhaps 30, slight and dark-haired, who entered the room with the careful movements of someone trying very hard not to attract attention. She was pretty in an anxious way, with large brown eyes that seemed permanently startled, and she spoke so quietly that Sir Reginald had to ask her to repeat her name. But when Aldous Kemp walked through the door, Adeline Price did not merely react. She went white, not pale, white. The colour left her face so completely and so suddenly that for a moment I thought she was about to faint. She turned away toward the window and stood there with her back to the room, one hand resting on the curtain, and did not turn around for nearly a full minute. Kemp himself was a well-built man of 40, expensively dressed, with the confident stride of someone who had made money and enjoyed the fact. His face was broad and florid, and his smile came quickly and often, the smile of a man who had learned that charm was a more efficient weapon than argument. He greeted Sir Reginald with easy familiarity, complimented the sherry, and scanned the room with eyes that were friendly on the surface and calculating beneath. When he saw Holmes, the calculation sharpened. When he saw Miss Price at the window, the smile disappeared. It returned a moment later, broader than before, and he crossed the room to introduce himself to me as though nothing had happened. But something had happened. I had watched it happen. Two people had seen each other and had both, in their different ways, been afraid. I looked at Holmes. He was leaning against the mantelpiece with his sherry untouched, watching everything with the absolute stillness of a man who is not merely observing, but recording. Miss Graves appeared in the doorway. "Dinner is served, Sir Reginald." We filed through to the dining room. The table was, as I had seen it earlier, 9 place settings, 9 chairs, 9 glasses gleaming in the candlelight. The room was lit entirely by candles, no gaslight, no oil lamps, and the effect was both beautiful and oppressive. The flames threw long shadows across the white cloth and up the walls, where more maritime relics hung in their cases, a set of signal flags mounted behind glass, a fragment of carved teak from a ship's rail, and, at the far end of the room, a massive painting of a harbour at dusk, the water stained orange and the ships reduced to dark silhouettes against a dying sky. Sir Reginald took his seat at the head of the table. Holmes and I were placed at his right and left. The 6 guests arranged themselves along the remaining chairs, and at the far end, directly opposite Sir Reginald, stood the 9th chair. It was empty. No one sat in it. No one moved toward it. But the place was fully laid. Plate, glass, cutlery, napkin folded into a precise triangle. And in the candlelight it did not look empty so much as expectant, as though whoever was meant to occupy it had merely stepped out for a moment and would return. Sir Reginald stared at it. "Miss Graves," he said, with a note of irritation, "I thought Mr. Holmes requested the extra setting remain, but surely we should at least remove the chair itself. It looks absurd." Miss Graves stood by the sideboard with a decanter in her hands. "I can remove it if you wish, sir." "I wish the table to look correct. We are 8. That chair is—" "Leave it," Holmes said again, quietly. Sir Reginald turned to him. "My dear Holmes, it is an empty chair." "Yes," Holmes said, "but it was not set by accident, and it was not set for someone who failed to arrive. That chair was placed deliberately, and until I understand by whom and for what purpose, I would prefer it to remain." A silence fell over the table. I saw Cross's hand move toward his leather case, resting against his chair leg. I saw Whitfield's jaw tighten. I saw Mrs. Lockhart look down at her plate, and I saw Kemp lean back in his chair and study the empty place setting with an expression I could not immediately read. Not curiosity, not amusement, but something closer to recognition, as though he had just understood a joke whose punchline he had been dreading. Miss Graves poured the wine without expression, and dinner began. It was during the 2nd course, a cold cucumber soup served with mechanical precision by Miss Graves, that I began to understand what Holmes had meant on the train. He had said that closed cases do not write letters unless they were closed incorrectly. Now, watching these 6 people seated around a candle-lit table in a house full of salvaged wreckage, I felt the truth of that observation in my bones. They were pretending to be strangers. The conversation was polite, impersonal, and utterly false. Sir Reginald carried it almost single-handedly, moving from topic to topic with the desperate energy of a host who senses that his evening is not going well, but cannot determine why. He spoke of the sea. He spoke of his collection. He spoke of a recent auction in Portsmouth, where he had acquired the logbook of a vessel lost off the Azores in 1851. No one listened. They were watching each other. Not openly, not with the frank curiosity of new acquaintances. They watched the way animals watch, in peripheral glances, in moments when the person they observed was looking elsewhere. Cross watched Kemp. Kemp watched Miss Price. Miss Price watched her plate. Mrs. Lockhart watched Holmes. Whitfield watched everyone with the cold vigilance of a man standing guard over something he did not intend to surrender. And Hartwell, poor Hartwell, watched his own trembling hands and tried to hold his soup spoon steady. Holmes saw all of it. I know he did, because at one point during the fish course he leaned toward me and murmured, so quietly that no one else could hear, "6 people, Watson. Not one of them surprised to see any of the others, they pretend otherwise, but every greeting tonight was a performance. They have met before, they have worked together before, and whatever bound them is the reason we are here." Miss Graves moved through the room like a shadow, refilling glasses, clearing plates, adjusting candles. She performed each task with a fluid, silent competence that made her almost impossible to notice. And I understood now why Holmes had called domestic service a form of invisibility. She was always present. She heard every word. She saw every glance. And yet not a single guest looked at her twice, except once. As she leaned past Captain Whitfield to set down a dish of roasted parsnips, she paused. and it was so brief that I might have imagined it, and looked at the empty 9th chair at the end of the table. Her face did not change, her hands did not tremble, but something passed through her expression like light moving behind a curtain, and in that instant I did not see a housekeeper. I saw a mourner. Then it was gone, and she moved on, and the evening continued, and the empty chair sat in its pool of candlelight at the end of the table, waiting for a guest who would never arrive. Chapter 3. A room full of survivors. Dinner concluded with a savoury of anchovy toast, and a Stilton that Sir Reginald presented with the pride of a man who had very little left to be proud of. The conversation had not improved. It had in fact grown worse, settling into a pattern of brittle pleasantries, interrupted by silences that lasted a beat too long, during which each guest seemed to retreat into a private calculation that had nothing to do with the food or the company. Holmes had said almost nothing throughout the meal. He had eaten little and drunk less, and his silence had the quality not of withdrawal but of absorption, the deep, intent quiet of a man who is listening to 6 conversations at once, most of them unspoken. When Sir Reginald suggested we retire to the drawing-room for brandy and coffee, the relief around the table was almost physical. Chairs scraped back. Mrs. Lockhart rose with a grateful smile. Hartwell steadied himself against the table edge with his trembling hand, and as the guests filed out, I noticed that not one of them looked back at the empty 9th chair. Not one, except Aldous Kemp. He paused in the doorway, half-turned, and regarded the vacant place setting with an expression I could now identify. It was not recognition. It was dread. He knew what that chair meant. He knew who it was for. And whatever armour of charm and confidence he had constructed over the years, that empty chair had found the crack in it. Then he turned away and followed the others, and Miss Graves began to clear the table in silence. The drawing-room was warmer now. The fire built up against the evening chill that crept in from the sea. Sir Reginald distributed brandy with the same desperate hospitality he had shown all evening, moving from guest to guest like a man trying to hold together a dinner party that was disintegrating for reasons he could not fathom. He was, I realized, genuinely bewildered. Whatever design had assembled these people under his roof, he was not part of it. Holmes positioned himself in an armchair near the window, slightly apart from the main group where the lamplight did not quite reach. From there he could observe the entire room without appearing to do so. I took the chair beside him, and for the next hour I watched him watch them. Mrs. Lockhart settled on the settee nearest the fire, and accepted coffee from Miss Graves with a murmured thanks. She was composed, elegant, and entirely self-possessed, and yet she held her cup with both hands, as though steadying something. She spoke easily with Sir Reginald about his charitable interests, and I gathered that she herself was a woman of considerable philanthropic reputation. She mentioned a hospital in Marylebone that she had helped to fund, a school for dockers' children in Rotherhithe, a subscription campaign for widows of merchant seamen. The list was long. It was, I thought, too long. Offered too readily, too fluently, as though she had rehearsed it many times and knew exactly how much goodness was required to fill whatever space she was trying to cover. At one point she glanced toward the doorway through which we had come from the dining room. It was a quick, involuntary glance, the kind a person gives when they are thinking of something they do not want to think of. Then she turned back to Sir Reginald and asked about the painting of the Dolorosa, and her voice was steady, and her smile was perfect, and I did not believe a word of it. Leonard Cross sat in a straight-back chair near the bookcase with his leather case propped against his ankle. He drank his brandy in small, precise sips and contributed to the conversation only when directly addressed. His replies were exact and economical, as though each word had been weighed on a scale before release. When Sir Reginald asked his professional opinion on the legal complexities of maritime salvage, Cross delivered a brief and technically flawless answer that managed to say nothing personal whatsoever. He was, I thought, a man who had long ago perfected the art of speaking without revealing. His face gave nothing away. His voice gave nothing away. Even his posture, upright, controlled, symmetrical, was a kind of fortification, but the leather case at his ankle told a different story. He touched it with his foot at intervals, the way a man might check that a door is still locked. Whatever was inside that case, it was not professional papers. It was something he could not afford to lose, and could not bear to leave unguarded. Holmes noticed this. I saw his eyes move to the case, then to Cross's foot, then back to Cross's face, and something settled in his expression. Not certainty, but the particular alertness that meant a piece had found its place in a pattern he was still assembling. Captain Whitfield stood by the mantelpiece and dominated it. He was one of those men whose physical presence filled whatever space they occupied, not through size alone, but through a rigidity of bearing that made relaxation seem like a concession he was unwilling to grant. He held his brandy glass as though it were a navigational instrument, and spoke in clipped declarative sentences that invited no reply. He had been watching Holmes all evening, and now, with the brandy loosening whatever restraint he had maintained at dinner, he addressed him directly. "I confess I find it curious, Mr. Holmes, that a man of your particular talents should be invited to a collector's dinner. I was not aware that criminal detection and maritime history shared much common ground." "They share more than you might suppose," Holmes replied. "Both concern themselves with things that have gone down and the question of what can be recovered." Whitfield's moustache twitched. "A pretty metaphor. I rarely deal in metaphor, Captain. I find that facts are more reliable, though less comfortable." "And have you found any facts this evening that interest you?" "Several," Holmes said, "but the evening is young." Whitfield held his gaze for a long moment, then turned away to examine a mounted chronometer on the wall. His back was very straight. His shoulders did not move, but his hand, I noticed, had tightened on his glass, until the knuckles showed white through the skin. He was afraid of Holmes. Not of what Holmes might do, but of what Holmes might see. Dr. Hartwell sat in the most comfortable chair in the room, a deep, our worn leather armchair near the fire, and seemed grateful for its shelter. He was perspiring lightly despite the mild temperature, and his colour was poor. The tremor I had noticed at dinner was more pronounced now, a persistent oscillation of both hands that he attempted to disguise by resting them on the chair's broad arms. When Miss Graves brought him coffee, he wrapped both hands around the cup and held it against his chest, and I saw the liquid tremble in the surface like a compass needle that could not find north. I moved my chair closer to him under the pretext of admiring the fire. "Dr. Hartwell," I said, "have you had a long journey?" "From Surrey," he said. "Not terribly far, but I find travel more tiring than I once did." He attempted a smile. "Age, I suppose." "I know the feeling," I said, though I did not believe age was the cause. "You are in general practice?" "Semi-retired now. I was a company physician for many years, industrial work mostly, shipping firms, dockside operations, insurance assessments." He paused as if he had said more than he intended. "Dull stuff, I'm afraid." "Not at all. I did some work with merchant firms myself, early in my career." He looked at me with sudden and surprising warmth, the look of a man who has not been spoken to kindly in some time and is startled by the experience. "You're very generous, Dr. Watson. I've read your accounts, of course. Remarkable work. Remarkable man, your friend." He glanced toward Holmes, and the warmth drained from his face. What replaced it was not hostility, but something worse. A deep, exhausted guilt, the kind that has been carried so long it has become indistinguishable from the person carrying it. "Remarkable," he repeated quietly. "And thorough. Very thorough." I wanted to ask him what he meant, but Miss Graves appeared at that moment with fresh coffee, and Hartwell fell silent. It was as she leaned forward to pour that I looked again at her hands. The observation I had made upon arrival had not been mistaken. Her fingers were long, controlled, and marked with the faint ink stains of a habitual writer. They were not a servant's hands. They were the hands of an educated woman, a woman who had spent years putting words on paper with precision and care. But it was not only the ink that struck me now. It was the way she held the coffee pot. Her grip was steady, her movements fluid, her posture impeccable. And yet, there was a quality of deliberateness about it all that spoke not of natural ease, but of studied performance. She was playing the role of housekeeper, the way an actress plays a part she has rehearsed until it becomes second nature. Every gesture was correct. None of them were careless. She felt my gaze and met it. Her eyes were dark and very still, and for a moment I had the unsettling impression that she was not merely returning my look, but measuring it, deciding how much I had seen and whether it mattered. "More coffee, Dr. Watson?" she asked. "Thank you, Miss Graves." She poured, and as she did, she said, so softly that I almost missed it beneath the murmur of Sir Reginald's voice across the room, "The absent are often the most present in a room, Doctor." Then she straightened and moved on. Arson left me sitting with a coffee cup in my hand and a sentence in my mind that I could not quite account for. I looked toward Holmes. He was watching Miss Price. Adeline Price had positioned herself as far from Aldous Kemp as the room's geometry allowed, in a small chair near the window, with her back half turned to the company. She had refused brandy and accepted only water, which she held but did not drink. She was younger than the others, 30 at most, and everything about her posture suggested a woman trying to make herself smaller. Her shoulders were drawn in, her chin was lowered, her eyes moved constantly, flicking from face to face with the rapid, frightened vigilance of a creature that knows it is trapped. She had not spoken a voluntary word since entering the house, but Kemp watched her. He did it carefully, as with the practised sidelong attention of a man who knows how to observe without appearing to, and his expression when he looked at her was not the expression of a former lover, or even a former friend. It was the expression of a man assessing a liability, calculating whether something he had once controlled was still under control. At one point, when Sir Reginald's monologue drew the attention of the room toward a display case of tarnished naval medals, Kemp crossed to the window and stood beside Miss Price. He said something to her that I could not hear. She did not look up. He said something else. She shook her head once tightly, and her hand gripped the arm of her chair. Then Kemp smiled, a slow, private smile that contained no warmth, and returned to his seat. Holmes had seen all of it. And I could tell because his breathing had changed, that almost imperceptible shallowing that meant his attention had narrowed to a single point and was pressing on it with the full weight of his concentration. "Watson," he said, as the evening began to wind down and Sir Reginald proposed a toast to the enduring romance of the sea. "A word when we are alone." We retired to Holmes's room shortly after 11. The house had fallen quiet. Sir Reginald had gone to bed with his brandy and his good nature intact, still puzzled by the strange heaviness of his dinner party, but too polite to interrogate it. The guests had dispersed to their rooms with the hurried, avoidant movements of people who did not wish to be caught in conversation with one another in an unlit corridor. Holmes closed the door and stood with his back to it. "Observations," he said. "Several," I replied. "Hartwell is a morphine user. The tremor is unmistakable, bilateral, rhythmic, worse under social stress. He's been dependent for years." "Agreed. What else?" "Miss Price is terrified of Kemp. Not merely uncomfortable, genuinely afraid. And he knows it. He approached her deliberately tonight to remind her that he is here and that she is not free of him." "Good. Continue." "Cross is hiding something in that leather case. He will not let it out of his reach. And Mrs. Lockhart, I cannot prove it, but her philanthropy feels compensatory. She lists her good works the way a defendant lists character witnesses." Holmes allowed himself a thin smile. "You are improving, Watson. Now let me tell you what you missed." He moved to the desk and sat on its edge. His long fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Leonard Cross. You are correct that he is hiding something. But you did not observe that when he entered the drawing room tonight, he glanced at the maritime medals in the display case and immediately looked away. That case contains a service record from the Whitmore Maritime Company. Cross recognised it. He had no reason to recognise an obscure shipping firm's service medals unless he had professional dealings with that firm. He paused. Cross was the solicitor who handled Whitmore Maritime's legal affairs 5 years ago. I am now certain of it. I did not meet him during my investigation. The legal work was handled through intermediaries. But his name appeared in the margin of a ledger I examined. I dismissed it at the time. I was wrong to dismiss it. And the others? All 6 of them, Watson. Every guest at that table has a connection to the Whitmore Maritime pension fraud. Kemp was a shipping clerk in the same office as Daniel Ferris. Whitfield's naval career overlapped with Whitmore's supply routes. Hartwell was a company physician. He would have had access to restricted offices. Mrs. Lockhart's late husband held shares in Whitmore Maritime, and Miss Price, her terror of Kemp, her age, her silence. She was almost certainly a junior employee under his authority. He looked at me steadily. This is not a collector's dinner, Watson. This is a reunion, and whoever assembled it knew exactly what these people share, because that person shares it too, or was destroyed by it. I felt the chill of the house settle into my chest. Then we are not guests, I said. No, said Holmes. We were not invited, Watson. We were assembled. Every person under this roof was chosen, and every chair at that table was assigned, including the one that remains empty. He rose from the desk and moved to the window. The sea was invisible in the darkness, but I could hear it. The long, slow exhalation of waves against stone, rhythmic and relentless, like the breathing of something vast and patient. Tomorrow, Holmes said, I shall have a conversation with Sir Reginald, and then I shall begin to understand who is conducting this trial and what verdict they expect me to deliver. He drew the curtain, and the sound of the sea was muffled, though not silenced. Sleep well, Watson. I suspect the house has not yet finished speaking. Chapter 4. The host who was used. I slept poorly. The bed was comfortable enough, and the house was quiet, but the silence itself had a quality I found difficult to rest within, a watchful, breathing silence, as though the walls were listening with the same attentiveness that Holmes had brought to the dinner table. Twice I woke and lay still, convinced I had heard something moving in the corridor outside my door. Both times, when I held my breath and listened, there was nothing, or almost nothing. The second time, just before I dismissed it and turned over, I caught the faintest creak of a floorboard. Not outside my room, but somewhere below, in the depths of the house. It was a single sound, deliberate and controlled, of the footstep of someone who knew exactly which boards were silent and which were not. Then it was gone, and I slept again. And when I woke, the morning light was grey and flat, and the sea was visible for the first time, a long, dull line of pewter beneath a low sky. I found Holmes already dressed and standing in the garden below my window. He was examining the stone bird bath at the centre of the neglected lawn, not with any particular interest in the object itself, but with the distant, unfocused gaze that meant he was thinking. His coat was damp with morning dew. He had been outside for some time. Breakfast was laid in a small morning room adjacent to the dining room. It was a more intimate space, panelled in dark oak, with a single window overlooking the gravel drive. The table here was set for 8, correctly, while this time a sideboard held the usual array of covered dishes, toast racks, and a large silver urn of coffee that smelled strong enough to strip varnish. Sir Reginald was already seated, working his way through a plate of kidneys with the uncomplicated enjoyment of a man whose conscience permitted him to eat well. He greeted me warmly and launched immediately into a discussion of the morning's weather, and its implications for a coastal walk he had planned for his guests. The others arrived in 1s and 2s. Mrs. Lockhart appeared first, immaculate and poised, followed by Cross, who entered with his leather case and placed it beneath his chair before serving himself toast and marmalade, with the precision of a man performing minor surgery. Whitfield came in like a weather front, nodded to no one, and ate in silence. Hartwell arrived looking worse than he had the previous evening, grey-skinned, damp at the temples, his hands shaking badly enough that he abandoned the coffee cup after a single attempt and sat with his fingers laced together in his lap. Miss Price came last and sat at the far end of the table. She ate nothing. She drank half a cup of tea. She did not look at anyone. Kemp did not appear at all. His absence was not immediately remarkable. Guests at country weekends often kept irregular hours. But I noticed that Miss Graves, who was supervising the breakfast service, glanced at his empty chair more than once. Not with concern, with attention. Holmes entered from the garden, accepted coffee and ate a single piece of toast standing by the window. Then he set down his cup and addressed Sir Reginald with the conversational ease of a man making a casual request. "Sir Reginald, I wonder if you might spare me a quarter of an hour this morning. I have a professional interest in the provenance of your collection, and I should like to ask you about some of the pieces." Sir Reginald was delighted. Nothing pleased him more than an audience for his treasures, and he led Holmes away to his private study with the eager stride of a man who has finally found someone willing to listen. I was not invited, but Holmes caught my eye as he left the room and gave the slightest inclination of his head. A signal I knew well. It meant, "Follow in 5 minutes, and bring your notebook." I did. Sir Reginald's study was on the ground floor of the western wing, a cluttered, uncomfortable room dominated by a mahogany desk buried under correspondence and auction catalogues. The walls were lined with shelves bearing not books but artefacts, fragments of ship's timbers, coils of ancient rope, a row of green glass bottles recovered from some sunken cargo hold. A large chart of the Sussex coast hung behind the desk, pinned with coloured markers at wreck sites. Holmes was seated in a leather chair opposite Sir Reginald, his legs crossed, his manner relaxed and conversational. But I recognised the posture. It was the posture of an interrogation conducted so gently that the subject would never know it was happening. "And the chronometer in your room, Dr. Watson, was recovered from a brig that went down off Selsey Bill in '49, Sir Reginald was saying as I entered. "Remarkable piece. The mechanism still functions, though it loses 11 minutes per day. I find that rather poetic. A clock that survived a disaster but can no longer keep proper time." "A fine metaphor," Holmes said. "Now, Sir Reginald, I must ask you something that may seem impertinent, and I beg you to forgive the directness." "By all means. Your guest list. How did it come together?" Sir Reginald blinked. "In the usual way. I hold this dinner every year and invite people who share an interest in maritime history, or who might contribute to my collection, or who simply make for good company." "And this year's guests? Were they all your own selections?" There was a pause. Sir Reginald set down his teacup and frowned, not with suspicion, but with the genuine effort of a man trying to recall something he had not previously thought to examine. "Well," he said slowly, "Mrs. Lockhart I invited on the recommendation of a colleague at the Maritime Historical Society. She has funded several preservation projects and seemed a natural fit. Captain Whitfield, Miss Graves mentioned that she had read of his distinguished naval career in the Gazette, and suggested he might enjoy the collection. I wrote to him, and he accepted." "Miss Graves suggested him," Holmes repeated, without emphasis. "Yes. She has a keen interest in naval affairs, which I appreciate in a member of staff. She also brought Mr. Cross to my attention, said she had seen his name in connection with shipping law, and thought he might find the salvage questions interesting. Dr. Hartwell I invited through a medical acquaintance, though now I think of it. Miss Graves had mentioned his name first in the context of maritime insurance assessments." Holmes said nothing. He waited. Sir Reginald's frown deepened. "And Miss Price, she is the niece of a man I once corresponded with about a logbook collection. At least, that is what Miss Graves told me. And Mr. Kemp, insurance, I believe. Miss Graves mentioned he had some connection to underwriting in the shipping industry." He stopped. The silence in the room was very specific. It was the silence of a man who has just heard his own words and understood, for the first time, what they meant. "Good Lord," Sir Reginald said. "She suggested all of them." "Every one," Holmes confirmed. Over a period of months, always with a plausible reason, always connected to your interests, always presented as your idea rather than hers. You were not selecting your guests, Sir Reginald. You were approving hers. Sir Reginald sat back in his chair. His face had lost its colour. But why? Why would Miss Graves want these particular people in my house? That is what I intend to determine. Tell me, when you hired her 6 months ago, what did you know of her background? She came with excellent references. A previous position in a household in Kent, I believe. Quiet, capable, well-spoken. I remember thinking she was overqualified, frankly. Her manner suggested education well beyond what one expects in domestic service. But she seemed content with the position, and I was in need of a housekeeper, and one does not interrogate good fortune. Did you verify the references? No, I don't believe I did. They were written on good paper and said the right things, and I confess I took them at face value. Holmes rose from his chair and moved to the window. The morning light fell across his face, and I could see the tension in the line of his jaw, not anger, but the sharp, compressed focus that preceded his most decisive moments. "Sir Reginald," he said, "I must be frank with you. I believe your housekeeper is not who she claims to be. I believe she entered your household with the specific intention of using your annual dinner as a gathering point for a group of people she wished to confront. You have been used, not maliciously, and not without a certain respect for your person, but used nonetheless." Sir Reginald opened his mouth, closed it, and opened it again. "Confront them about what?" "About a crime committed 5 years ago. A crime in which I myself played a role, though not, I now fear, the role I believed at the time." "What crime?" Holmes turned from the window. "The Whitmore Maritime Pension Fraud. A shipping clerk named Daniel Ferris was convicted on evidence I helped assemble. He was sentenced to hard labour. He died in prison 8 months ago." Sir Reginald shook his head. "I don't understand. What has that to do with my dinner party?" "Everything. The 6 guests your housekeeper selected were all connected to the original crime. They were not innocent bystanders who happened to work in the same industry. They were participants, some directly, some through complicity, some through silence. Daniel Ferris was guilty, but he was not guilty alone. He was, I now believe, the least powerful member of a conspiracy that ensured he would bear the full weight of punishment, while the others walked free." I watched Sir Reginald's face as this landed. He was not a stupid man, merely a trusting one, and the betrayal he was processing was not primarily intellectual, but personal. He had liked Miss Graves. He had trusted her. He had believed she was content in his employ. And the discovery that she had been using his home and his hospitality as instruments in a campaign of justice nor vengeance was not something he could absorb quickly. "She seemed so steady," he said, almost to himself. "She is steady," Holmes replied. "That is what makes her formidable. A woman driven by rage would have made mistakes. Miss Graves has made none. Every element of this weekend has been arranged with a patience and precision that I confess I find remarkable. She has turned your house into a courtroom, Sir Reginald, and she has done it so carefully that until this morning I was not entirely certain whether the architect was one of the guests or one of the staff. What do you propose to do?" Holmes considered this for a moment. "For now, nothing. I do not yet have proof of her identity, only a strong suspicion, and I do not wish to force a confrontation before I understand the full scope of what she has planned. There are mechanisms at work in this house, disturbances, signals, provocations, that I have not yet traced to their source. When I have, I will act." He paused at the door. "In the meantime, Sir Reginald, I would ask you to behave as though this conversation never occurred. Treat Miss Graves as you always have. Treat your guests as welcome visitors. And if you notice anything unusual in the house tonight, sounds in the walls, objects where they should not be, doors that open or close without explanation, do not investigate. Come to me." Sir Reginald nodded, pale and shaken. Holmes and I left the study and walked in silence through the long corridor of glass cases. The salvaged relics watched us from behind their panes. Broken instruments, stained logbooks, the remnants of voyages that had ended in disaster. At the far end of the corridor, where it opened into the entrance hall, Holmes stopped. "She has made no mistakes, Watson," he said quietly. "Not one. In 6 months she has infiltrated a household, manipulated a host, assembled a jury of the guilty, and invited the one man in England capable of reopening the case she needs reopened. And she has done it all while pouring tea and laying table settings." He looked back down the corridor toward the dining room where the 9th chair still waited. "We were not invited, Watson. We were assembled, and I begin to think the woman who assembled us understands justice better than I gave anyone credit for." Chapter 5. The House Begins to Accuse. The morning passed in uneasy calm. Sir Reginald, to his credit, maintained his composure, and proposed the coastal walk he had mentioned at breakfast. Mrs. Lockhart and Hartwell accepted. Whitfield declined with a curt reference to correspondence. Cross retired to his room with his leather case. Miss Price said she would prefer to read in the drawing-room. De Kemp had still not appeared. Holmes did not join the walk. He told Sir Reginald he wished to examine the house's architectural features, a plausible enough excuse given the building's age and character. And the moment the walking party had departed down the gravel path toward the cliffs, he began a systematic exploration of Blackthorn House. I accompanied him. We started in the basement. The lower level of the house was a labyrinth of stone-walled corridors, storage rooms, and service passages that had been built for a staff 3 times the size Sir Reginald currently employed. The air was cold and carried the mineral smell of chalk and damp. Most of the rooms were empty or filled with dust-sheeted furniture, but Holmes was not interested in the rooms themselves. He was interested in the walls. He moved through the corridors with his head tilted, tapping the stonework at intervals with his knuckles, listening to the sound each surface returned. In the 3rd passage he stopped. "Here," he said. He pressed his ear to the wall. Then he ran his fingers along the mortar line until he found what he was looking for. A small circular opening, no larger than a sovereign, set into the stone at shoulder height and partially concealed behind a wooden bracket that had once supported a shelf. "A speaking tube," he said. The house was built in the 1790s, when these were common in large households. The servants used them to communicate between floors without climbing stairs. He blew gently into the opening, and a faint, hollow whistle echoed somewhere above us. "This one runs upward into the eastern wing, the guest corridor, unless I am mistaken." We found 3 more over the following hour. The system was extensive, connecting the basement to the ground floor to the 1st floor, and, most significantly, running behind the walls of the guest bedrooms. Most of the tubes had been sealed with plaster, or blocked with debris over the decades, but several had been recently cleared. The plaster around their openings was fresh, the dust inside them wiped clean, and one bore a faint residue of beeswax on its rim, as though someone had polished the metal to improve the acoustics. "She has restored them," Holmes said. "Selectively, carefully, and recently. These tubes would allow someone in the basement to project sound into any of the guest rooms. Footsteps, whispers, the suggestion of movement. In a house this old, with its settling timbers and creaking floorboards, the effect would be indistinguishable from a genuine presence." "The sounds I heard last night," I said. "Almost certainly, and you will not have been the only one." We returned to the ground floor, and Holmes turned his attention to the east hall, the long corridor connecting the drawing-room to the morning-room, lined with more of Sir Reginald's glass display cases. It was here that something else caught his eye. The corridor was dim even in daylight, lit by 2 small windows at either end, and a single gas sconce halfway along that had not been lit. The display cases lined both walls, their glass fronts reflecting the faint light in overlapping planes. Holmes walked the length of the corridor slowly, then walked it again, then stopped and stood very still. "Watson, come here. Stand where I am standing and look toward the far end." I did. At first I saw nothing unusual. The corridor stretching away, the cases on either side, the pale rectangle of the window at the far end. Then I shifted my weight and the light changed, and for a brief, disorienting moment I saw a figure standing in the corridor ahead of me. I flinched. Then I understood. The figure was my own reflection, caught at an angle between two display cases whose glass fronts had been positioned so that they created a mirror effect. But the reflection was not clean. It was distorted, elongated, darkened, shifted slightly off axis, so that what I saw was not myself, but a version of myself that was taller, thinner, and wrong in a way I could not immediately articulate. "Good God," I said. "Ah, that is deeply unsettling." "It is brilliant," Holmes replied, and there was genuine admiration in his voice. "The cases have been adjusted. Their angles are not original. The mounting brackets show recent tool marks. Someone has repositioned them so that in low light, anyone walking this corridor will see not a ghost but themselves, transformed into something they do not recognize." He paused and looked at me, with an expression caught between professional respect and moral disquiet. The seventh guest each of them saw was themselves, Watson, reflected, distorted, and made strange. There is no phantom in this house. There is only guilt, given a shape it cannot look away from. We were still in the east corridor when Adeline Price found us. She came from the drawing room at a pace that was not quite running, but was certainly not the measured walk of a woman at ease. Her face was flushed and her eyes were wide, and she held something in her hand, a small, cream-coloured envelope. "Mr. Holmes," she said, and her voice was thin and tight and barely controlled. "I found this in my room, on my pillow. It was not there this morning." Holmes took the envelope. Inside was a single item, a fragment of paper, yellowed with age, bearing a few lines of handwritten text. I could not read the words from where I stood, but I saw Holmes's face as he examined them, and what I saw there was not surprise but confirmation. "Do you recognize this handwriting, Miss Price?" he asked. She shook her head, but her hands were trembling. "It is a fragment of a letter," Holmes said, "written by a man named Daniel Ferris from Dartmoor Prison, approximately 4 years ago. The passage concerns a woman he once trusted, a woman who, he writes, destroyed something on his behalf without understanding that she was destroying the only evidence that might have saved him." Miss Price made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound a person makes when something they have spent years burying is suddenly and without warning uncovered. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't know what they were. He told me they were nothing. He told me to burn them, and I burned them, and I didn't know." "Miss Price," Holmes said, not unkindly. "Sit down." She sat on the narrow bench beneath the window. Holmes regarded her for a moment, then turned to me. "Watson, would you ask the other guests to check their rooms? I suspect Miss Price is not the only one who has received a delivery." She was not. Over the next hour the house came apart. Mrs. Lockhart found a child's hospital invoice on her writing desk, a bill for treatment at a sanatorium in Switzerland, dated 5 years earlier, paid from an account she clearly recognised. She brought it to Holmes with the controlled dignity of a woman walking to the scaffold, said nothing, and returned to her room. Captain Whitfield discovered a naval transfer receipt tucked inside the logbook on his bedside table. I did not see the document, but I saw his face when he emerged from his room, and it was the face of a man whose carefully maintained fortress had been breached from within. He said nothing to Holmes. He said nothing to anyone. He locked his door and did not come out for the rest of the afternoon. Hartwell found a prescription slip, his own, dated 5 years earlier, authorizing access to restricted company offices after normal working hours. He brought it to Holmes with shaking hands and eyes that were red and wet and utterly defeated. "I signed it," he said. "God help me, I signed it. I needed the money and he said no one would ever know, and I signed it." Cross found nothing, or rather, Cross claimed to have found nothing. But when Holmes passed his room that afternoon, the door was closed, and through it came the faint, unmistakable sound of a man breathing in the short, controlled rhythm of someone who is holding himself together by force of will alone. Of Kemp there was still no sign. His room was locked from the outside. His breakfast had gone untouched. Miss Graves, when asked, said only that Mr. Kemp had mentioned a headache the previous evening and had perhaps chosen to rest. Holmes did not press her. Not yet. That evening, dinner was a ruin. Sir Reginald attempted conversation and was met with silence. The 9th chair sat empty at the end of the table, its place setting undisturbed, and now every guest stared at it, openly, helplessly, as though the chair had acquired a gravity that pulled their eyes toward it against their will. The extra setting, which Sir Reginald had quietly asked Miss Graves to clear before dinner, was back. The glass was damp. The cutlery had been shifted. A crumb of bread lay beside the plate. Someone had dined there. No one spoke of it. No one needed to. The accusation was silent and complete, and it sat at the end of the table like a judge who had already reached a verdict and was simply waiting for the condemned to finish their meal. After dinner, Holmes stood by the fireplace in the drawing-room and said, to no one in particular, "The 7th guest each of you saw in the east corridor was yourselves." No one replied. "The sounds you heard in the walls last night were projected through a system of speaking tubes that runs throughout this house. There is no ghost at Blackthorn House. There is no intruder. There is only a mechanism of reminder, operated by someone who knows what each of you has done and has decided that the time for silence is over." He looked at each of them in turn. Mrs. Lockhart, Cross, Whitfield, Hartwell, Miss Price. Each face was a different portrait of the same emotion, the terrible, vertiginous recognition of being known. "You're not here by accident," Holmes said. "You were chosen, and the person who chose you did so because 5 years ago a man named Daniel Ferris was convicted of a crime that none of you have ever been held accountable for. He is dead, and this house, every mirror, every whisper, every object placed on your pillows, is his voice, reaching you from beyond a grave that should never have been his." The fire cracked. The sea breathed against the cliffs below, and somewhere in the house, a door closed softly. Chapter 6. The Case I Thought I Solved. The drawing-room emptied quickly after Holmes's address. The guests retreated to their rooms with the haste of people fleeing not a place but a presence, the presence of their own exposure, which now hung in the air of Blackthorn House as palpably as the salt and damp that crept through its walls. No one said good night. No one lingered over brandy. Mrs. Lockhart was the last to leave, and she paused at the doorway long enough to look back at Holmes with an expression that was neither hostile nor pleading, but something rarer, the look of a woman who has carried a weight for years and is not yet certain whether having it seen is a relief or a catastrophe. Then she was gone, and the room held only Holmes, myself, the dying fire, and the painting of the Dolorosa breaking apart above the mantelpiece. Holmes did not speak for several minutes. He stood at the window with his back to me, his reflection a dark shape against the glass, and I could see from the set of his shoulders that what was happening inside him was not the familiar exhilaration of a case advancing, but something heavier and less welcome. I waited. I had learned, over many years, that there were silences Holmes used to think, and silences he used to prepare himself for something he did not want to say. This was the latter. "Watson," he said at last, still facing the window, "I owe you an account, not of this case as it stands now, but of the case as it was 5 years ago. Because if I am right about what is happening in this house, and I believe I am, then the crime being prosecuted tonight is not solely the crime of the 6 people who sat at that table. It is also mine." He turned from the window. His face was drawn and pale in the lamplight, and there was something in his eyes that I had seen only a handful of times in all the years I had known him. The bleak, unsparing clarity of a man examining his own failure. "Sit down," he said. "This will take some time." I sat. Holmes remained standing, moving between the fireplace and the window with the restless, measured pacing that accompanied his most difficult confessions. "The Whitmore Maritime case came to me in the autumn of 1890, he began. "A pension fund belonging to retired dock workers of the Whitmore Maritime Company had been systematically drained over a period of 18 months. The amount was substantial, nearly £4,000, representing the savings and security of some 60 men and their families. The company's directors suspected internal fraud and engaged me to identify the responsible party." "I remember you mentioning it," I said. "You were occupied with it for several weeks." 3 weeks. It should have taken longer. That is the first thing I failed to recognize." He paused by the fire and rested one hand on the mantelpiece. "The evidence led me to Daniel Ferris, a junior shipping clerk in the company's accounts office. He had direct access to the pension ledgers. His initials appeared on the falsified transfer orders. His movements corresponded precisely to the dates on which funds were withdrawn. And when I examined his personal finances, I found expenditures that exceeded his salary. Modest expenditures, Watson. Not extravagant, but enough to suggest supplementary income." "It sounds conclusive." It was conclusive. That was the problem. Holmes's voice carried a bitterness I rarely heard. "It was the cleanest case I had ever worked. Every thread led to Ferris. Every document bore his mark. Every timeline confirmed his access. There were no loose ends, no contradictions, no unexplained anomalies. The case solved itself with a neatness that I mistook for elegance." He turned to face me. "I was proud of it, Watson. I presented my findings to the company directors and to Scotland Yard with the satisfaction of a man who had done precise and thorough work. Ferris was arrested, tried, and convicted within 2 months. He protested his innocence throughout. Not completely, you understand. He admitted his involvement in the fraud, but he insisted, repeatedly and with increasing desperation, that he had not acted alone. He named others. He spoke of a wider conspiracy. He begged for further investigation. And I dismissed it. I dismissed it because the evidence did not support it. Every document, every ledger entry, every financial trail pointed to Ferris and Ferris alone. His claims of co-conspirators appeared to be the desperate fabrications of a guilty man trying to dilute his punishment by spreading blame." Holmes was silent for a moment. "I was wrong." The words fell into the room like stones into still water. Holmes did not soften them, did not qualify them, did not offer the usual caveats about incomplete information or reasonable assumptions. He said it plainly and let it stand. "The evidence was clean because it had been cleaned," he continued. "The trail led only to Ferris because every other trail had been erased. What I interpreted as an elegant solution was in fact an elegant construction, a careful, deliberate arrangement of facts designed to ensure that one man would be visible and 6 others would not. Someone removed the documents that would have revealed the wider conspiracy. Someone forged the transfer orders to bear only Ferris's initials. Someone ensured that his access records were prominent, while theirs were buried or destroyed." "The 6 guests," I said. "Yes. Each played a specific role. Cross-drafted the legal instruments that disguised the theft as legitimate investment movement. Kemp, as Ferris's direct superior, directed the false entries and ensured that the younger man's name appeared on every incriminating document. Hartwell's medical authority gave them after-hours access to restricted offices. Now, Whitfield moved the stolen funds through naval supply channels where they could not be easily traced. Mrs. Lockhart's husband profited from the stolen money. Part of it paid for their son's medical treatment abroad, and she remained silent when she discovered the truth. And Miss Price destroyed the correspondence that would have revealed the conspiracy. She told us as much this afternoon, I said, remembering her broken whisper in the east corridor. She destroyed letters without knowing their significance. The others knew exactly what they were doing. They constructed Daniel Ferris as a scapegoat with the same care and precision that a builder constructs a wall. Each brick laid deliberately, each joint sealed against inspection, and I examined the wall and pronounced it sound. He stopped pacing and sat down across from me. The fire had burned low, and the room was growing cold, but neither of us moved to rebuild it. Watson, I've made errors before. I've been deceived by clever criminals, outwitted by resourceful opponents, and occasionally blinded by my own assumptions. These are professional failures, and I accept them as the cost of the work I do. But this is different. This is a failure not of method, but of attention. I had the evidence before me. Ferris told me there were others. I did not listen because the case was already solved, and a solved case is a seductive thing. It flatters the intellect. It rewards certainty. And certainty, as I have told you many times, is the enemy of truth. You could not have known, I said. The evidence was deliberately arranged to mislead you. I could not have known with certainty, but I could have doubted. I could have questioned why the case resolved so cleanly when financial conspiracies almost never do. I could have asked why a junior clerk with no history of criminal behaviour would suddenly orchestrate a fraud of this magnitude without assistance. I could have investigated the people around Ferris instead of accepting that Ferris was the entirety of the crime. He paused. I did none of those things. I solved the case, collected my fee, and moved on to the next problem, and Daniel Ferris spent the last 5 years of his life in Dartmoor Prison, where he died of pneumonia 8 months ago, having never been believed. The clock on the mantelpiece struck midnight. Its sound was thin and slightly off-key, another salvaged timepiece that could no longer keep proper time. That is what Miss Graves understands, Holmes said quietly. That is why she brought me here, not to solve the mystery of the seventh guest. That is theatre, designed to unsettle the guilty and force them toward confession. She brought me here to sit in the same room with the people I failed to see and to understand, finally, what my certainty cost. I had no adequate response. I had seen Holmes in many states, triumphant, frustrated, bored, galvanized, amused, and on rare occasions afraid. But I had never seen him like this. The self-recrimination was not theatrical. It was not the dramatic self-flagellation of a proud man performing humility. It was genuine and quiet and terrible in its precision, because Holmes applied to his own failure the same analytical rigour he applied to everything else, and the conclusion he reached was not ambiguous. And he had been used as an instrument of injustice, not by malice, not by corruption, but by the simple, devastating mechanism of a case that's solved too well. "What will you do?" I asked. Holmes looked at me. The firelight caught the sharp planes of his face and threw shadows beneath his eyes that made him look older than his years. "I will finish what she started," he said. "The evidence Cross carries in that leather case, if it contains what I believe it contains, it will prove that Ferris did not act alone. Combined with what the guests have already revealed through their reactions to the planted objects, it may be enough to reopen the case and correct the historical record." "And Miss Graves? Eleanor Ferris?" "She has committed acts that are, by any legal standard, criminal. Infiltration under a false identity. Unlawful confinement, if Kemp's disappearance is her doing. Psychological manipulation of vulnerable individuals. She has operated outside the law with a thoroughness that most criminals would envy. But," Holmes was quiet for a long moment, "but she has done it in pursuit of a truth that should have been uncovered 5 years ago. And the reason it was not uncovered is that I was too certain of my own conclusions to look beyond them." He rose from his chair and moved toward the door. "I do not yet know what justice looks like in this case, Watson. I know only that the version I delivered 5 years ago was incomplete, and that the woman pouring wine in this house has understood that longer than I have." He opened the door. The corridor beyond was dark and silent. "Tomorrow, I suspect the house will deliver its final act. Kemp has not been seen since last night. Whatever Eleanor Ferris has planned for him, it is the centerpiece of her design, the architect of the conspiracy, confronted at last with the man he destroyed. He stepped into the corridor, then turned back. I solved the case, Watson, but perhaps I never solved the crime. He said it as though he were repeating a sentence he had been composing in his mind all evening, testing its weight, measuring its truth, and finding it heavier than he wished. Then he was gone, and I sat alone in the dying firelight of a house full of wreckage, listening to the sea. Chapter 7. The Man Who Vanished from Judgment. I do not know what time I finally retired. The fire had collapsed to a bed of grey ash, and the drawing room had grown cold enough that I could see my breath in the lamplight. I climbed the stairs slowly, my mind heavy with what Holmes had told me, and paused on the first-floor landing to listen. The house was not silent. It breathed, the deep, irregular respiration of an old building settling against the earth, its timbers contracting in the cold, its joints shifting with the faint, arthritic patience of something that had been standing too long. But beneath these ordinary sounds there was something else. A murmur, low, rhythmic and directionless, as though the walls themselves were whispering. I stood very still. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from the plaster, from the floorboards, from the air between the walls. It was not language exactly. It was the ghost of language, the cadence and pressure of speech stripped of its words, reduced to pure tone. The speaking tubes. Eleanor Ferris was using them again. I listened for perhaps a minute, then the sound stopped. The house settled back into its ordinary silence, and I went to bed with the conviction that whatever this night held, it was not yet finished. I was right. At 2:10 in the morning, I was woken by a sharp knock at my door. I opened it to find Holmes fully dressed, his coat on, his eyes bright with the particular intensity that meant something had moved. "Kemp is gone," he said. "Gone? Gone where?" "That is the question. Dress quickly." I dressed in 3 minutes and followed Holmes downstairs. The house was dark except for a single lamp burning in the entrance hall, and as we descended I saw that we were not alone. Sir Reginald stood at the foot of the stairs in his dressing gown, looking bewildered and frightened. Beside him was Captain Whitfield, rigid and fully clothed. I doubted he had slept at all, and Mrs. Lockhart, who had thrown a shawl over her nightdress, and stood with her arms crossed and her face composed into an expression of determined calm that did not quite conceal the fear beneath it. "What has happened?" I asked. "Miss Price raised the alarm," Holmes said. "She heard a disturbance in the corridor outside Kemp's room approximately 30 minutes ago. When she opened her door, the corridor was empty, but Kemp's door was ajar and his room was unoccupied. His bed has not been slept in, his luggage is untouched, his coat and hat are still on the stand in his room." "He never went to bed?" "It appears not, and he was not seen at any point today, which means he has been unaccounted for since last night, nearly 20 hours. Sir Reginald made a sound of distress. "Should we send for the police?" "Not yet," Holmes said. "Kemp has not left the house. His coat is here. The night is cold and wet, and the nearest village is 4 miles by road. Whatever has happened to him, it has happened within these walls." He turned to the small group assembled in the hall. Cross had appeared on the stairs, dressed but dishevelled, his leather case clutched to his chest. Hartwell stood behind him, grey and shaking, wrapped in a blanket. Miss Price hovered near the drawing-room door, her face streaked with tears she had not bothered to wipe away. Miss Graves was not present. "We will search the house," Holmes said, systematically floor by floor, beginning with the ground level. "Watson, you are with me? Captain Whitfield, take Sir Reginald and search the eastern wing. Mr. Cross, Dr. Hartwell, the western wing and the service areas. Mrs. Lockhart, Miss Price, remain here in the entrance hall. If Kemp appears, do not let him leave." The search began. Holmes and I took the central portion of the ground floor, the drawing room, the morning room, the study, the long corridor of display cases. We moved quickly and thoroughly, checking behind curtains, inside cupboards, beneath furniture. The house yielded nothing. Every room was empty, every door accounted for, every window latched from within. It was Holmes who suggested the dining room. We had passed it twice already. The door was closed, and I had assumed it was empty. But Holmes stopped before it on our third pass and stood very still, his head tilted, listening. "Do you hear that?" he said. I listened. At first there was nothing. Then, faintly, so faintly that I might have been imagining it, a sound, not footsteps, not voices, a ticking, slow, deliberate and slightly irregular, like a clock that had been damaged and was struggling to maintain its rhythm. Holmes opened the door. The dining room was dark. The candles had been extinguished hours ago, and the curtains were drawn. The only light came from the corridor behind us, throwing a long yellow parallelogram across the floor and the near edge of the table. The table was laid for 9. The place settings gleamed faintly in the borrowed light, and at the far end of the table, in the 9th chair, Daniel Ferris's chair, something was different. Holmes struck a match and lit the candelabra nearest the door, and the flames rose and the room materialized around us in slow, flickering stages. The white cloth, the silver, the glasses, the painting of the harbour at the far wall, and the 9th chair. On the seat of the 9th chair lay a pocket watch. It was open, its face was visible, and it was ticking, but wrongly with the laboured, arrhythmic stutter of a mechanism that had been submerged in water and only partially recovered. The case was damp. Condensation beaded the glass, and the hands were stopped at 11:17. Holmes crossed the room and examined the watch without touching it. Then he lifted the plate at the 9th place setting. Beneath it lay a folded piece of paper. He opened it. The message was written in the same disciplined, educated hand as the invitation that had brought us to Blackthorn House. 5 words. Us in black ink. 7 were always guilty. Holmes read it twice, then set it down on the table beside the watch. His face in the candlelight was very still. "Kemp's watch," I said. "Yes. The monogram on the case is his, a JK, and the condensation is not from rain. It carries the mineral smell of cellar air. This watch has been underground." He straightened and looked at the 9th chair. The iron restraint loop I had noticed before was still visible beneath the armrest, that small, cruel detail that transformed a dining chair into something else entirely. The watch sat on the seat as though it had been placed there by someone making an offering at a shrine. "She has taken him," I said. "She has taken him somewhere beneath this house and left his watch as proof that the 7th chair is no longer empty in spirit alone." The watch stopped at 11:17, the time, I suspect, at which Kemp was removed from the upper floors. That was last night, shortly after the guests retired. He has been missing for over 24 hours. Is he alive? I believe so. Eleanor Ferris does not want blood. She wants confession. She wants Kemp to sit in the dark with the man he destroyed, not as a corpse but as a conscience. Killing him would end the pressure. Confinement extends it indefinitely. He moved to the sideboard and examined the wall behind it. His fingers traced the panelling until he found what he was looking for. A seam in the wood, almost invisible, running vertically from floor to waist height. He pressed it. Nothing happened. He pressed again, harder, and there was a soft click. And a section of panelling swung inward to reveal a narrow passage with stone steps descending into darkness. The air that rose from below was cold, damp, and very old. "A butler's passage," Holmes said, "leading to the wine cellar. This is how she moved him. Through the service corridors, in the dead of night, using routes she has spent 6 months memorizing." We descended. The steps were worn smooth and slightly damp, and the walls pressed close on either side. The passage turned once, then opened into a low-ceilinged cellar lined with wine racks, most of them empty. The air was thick with the smell of damp stone and old oak. At the far end of the cellar, behind a heavy wooden door that had been recently fitted with a new bolt, we found him. Aldous Kemp sat on a wooden chair in a small, all-windowless room that had once been a secondary wine store. A single candle burned on the floor beside him, nearly spent. He was not bound, he was not gagged, he was not injured, but he was broken. His coat was off, his collar was open, his face was the colour of tallow, and his eyes, those confident, calculating eyes that had surveyed the drawing-room with such practised ease 2 nights ago, were red-rimmed and hollow, and stared at nothing. Around him, arranged on the stone floor in a careful semicircle, lay 3 items: a bundle of letters tied with string, prison letters, written in a cramped and desperate hand on coarse paper, Daniel Ferris's letters from Dartmoor, a single sheet of official stationery bearing the seal of the prison service, a death report. I did not need to read it to know whose death it recorded, and a photograph, small, creased, sepia-toned, a young man of perhaps 20, standing beside a woman in a plain dark dress, both of them squinting into sunlight before a modest terraced house. The young man's face was open and unguarded, and he smiled with the easy confidence of someone who believed that the world would treat him fairly. Daniel Ferris, before the crime, before the trial, before the prison, and the pneumonia, and the unmarked end. Kemp had not been tortured. He had not been threatened. He had been placed in a dark room with a complete record of a man's destruction, and left alone with it for 24 hours. "Mr. Kemp," Holmes said. Kemp looked up. It took him a moment to focus. When he did, what crossed his face was not relief at being found, but something closer to resignation, the expression of a man who has spent the night dismantling his own defences and no longer has the energy to rebuild them. "He wrote to me," Kemp said. His voice was hoarse and barely audible. "From prison. 7 letters. I never opened them. I never opened a single one." He looked down at the bundle on the floor. "She opened them for me. She read them aloud through the wall. Every word. Every word he wrote to me, asking why I had abandoned him, asking what he had done to deserve it, asking me to tell someone, anyone, that he had not acted alone." His voice cracked. "I coached him, Mr. Holmes. I showed him where to make the entries. I told him it was safe. I told him no one would ever look. And when they looked, I made certain they would find only him." Holmes said nothing. He stood in the doorway of the cellar room and regarded Kemp with an expression that held no triumph, no satisfaction, and no mercy. Only the cold, exhaustive attention of a man hearing a confession he should have extracted 5 years ago. "Can you stand?" I asked. Kemp nodded. I helped him to his feet. He was unsteady but not seriously weakened, dehydrated, cold, and emotionally devastated, but physically intact. As we guided him toward the cellar steps, he stopped and looked back at the photograph on the floor. "He trusted me," Kemp said. "He was 23 years old, and he trusted me, and I let him go to prison for something I built." Holmes picked up the photograph, the letters, and the death report. He examined each one briefly, then placed them inside his coat. "These are evidence," he said. "They will be treated as such." We climbed the stairs in silence and emerged into the dining room, where the 9th chair waited in its ring of candlelight, with Kemp's broken watch still ticking its damaged, arrhythmic time. Holmes looked at the watch, then at Kemp, then at the empty chair. "This is not revenge, Watson," he said quietly. "This is prosecution." Chapter 8. The Hidden Prosecutor. We brought Kemp to the drawing-room. The others were already assembled there, summoned by the noise of our search, or driven from their rooms by the impossibility of sleep, in a house that had become, over the course of 2 days, a machine designed to strip away every comfortable fiction they had constructed around themselves. Sir Reginald had built up the fire, and was standing beside it with the dazed, a helpless expression of a man whose world has departed from every script he knew how to follow. Whitfield stood at the far end of the room with his arms folded, his jaw set, his eyes moving between Kemp and Holmes, with the wary calculation of a man assessing how much of a perimeter has been breached. Mrs. Lockhart sat on the settee with her hands folded in her lap, and her face composed into a stillness so complete it could only be the product of enormous effort. Cross occupied his usual straight-backed chair, the leather case on his knees, his fingers resting on its clasp with the delicacy of a man holding a grenade. Hartwell sat in the deep armchair nearest the fire, shaking, his face the colour of wet plaster. Miss Price stood by the window, half-turned away from the room, her arms wrapped around herself as though she were cold. Though the fire had made the room almost uncomfortably warm, Miss Graves was not present. Holmes guided Kemp to a chair, and I fetched him water, which he drank in small mechanical sips without appearing to taste it. He did not look at the others. He did not look at anything. He sat with the emptied, deflated posture of a man from whom something structural had been removed. Holmes stood before the fireplace. The painting of the Dolorosa hung above him, its painted storm frozen in permanent catastrophe, and in the firelight his shadow stretched across the floor toward the assembled guests like the hand of a clock sweeping toward an hour none of them wished to reach. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "I will now explain what has been done to you," he said. "Not to frighten you further. You are already frightened enough. But because you are owed the mechanics of your own exposure, and because understanding them may help you appreciate the position in which you find yourselves." He paused and let the silence work. "2 nights ago you arrived at Blackthorn House believing yourselves to be guests at a collector's dinner. You were not. You were summoned, selected, assembled, and placed under one roof by a single individual who has spent the last 6 months preparing this weekend with a care and precision that I have rarely encountered in my professional life." He began with the guest list. He explained how each of them had been suggested to Sir Reginald by his housekeeper over a period of months, each under a different and perfectly plausible pretext, as he showed how the pretexts were tailored to Sir Reginald's known interests, maritime history, naval affairs, insurance, law, so that every suggestion appeared to originate from the host's own enthusiasm rather than from an outside design. Sir Reginald listened to this with the expression of a man watching his own house be disassembled brick by brick. Holmes moved to the house itself. He described the speaking tubes, how they had been selectively cleared and restored, allowing sound to be projected into the guest bedrooms from the basement. He explained the mirrors in the east corridor, how the display cases had been repositioned so that in low light, each person walking the hall would see not a phantom but their own reflection, distorted and made strange. He described the returned place setting at the 9th chair, the damp glass, yes, the shifted cutlery, the crumb of bread, and explained that it had been laid again each time it was cleared, always by the same hand, always in the dead hours when the house was asleep. The effect was cumulative, Holmes said. No single disturbance was dramatic enough to provoke flight or confrontation, but taken together, over 48 hours they created an atmosphere of mounting accusation, a sense that the house itself was watching, remembering, and judging. That was the intent. This house was turned into a theatre of conscience, and every one of you was given the role you earned 5 years ago. He turned to the planted objects. He described each one, the pension ledger fragment, the burned envelope, the naval transfer receipt, the prescription slip, the legal draft, the hospital invoice, and explained that they had been placed in the guests' rooms during the morning and afternoon, when the rooms were unoccupied, by someone with unrestricted access to every part of the house. Someone whose presence in every corridor, every bedroom, every service passage would never be questioned, Holmes said. Someone who carried trays and linens and was trained by the very nature of her position to be invisible. He let this settle. And finally, Aldous Kemp. He gestured toward the broken man in the chair. Mr. Kemp was removed from the upper floors on the first night, taken through a butler's passage concealed behind the dining room panelling, and confined in a cellar room beneath the house. He was not harmed. He was not bound. He was placed in a dark room with the prison letters of Daniel Ferris, with the official report of Daniel Ferris's death, and with a photograph of Daniel Ferris as a young man. and through the speaking tubes that run behind the cellar walls, Daniel Ferris's own words were read aloud to him. Every letter, every plea, every unanswered appeal, by a voice he could hear but could not see. Kemp made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound of something giving way. Holmes turned to the room. The architect of all of this, the guest list, the disturbances, the objects, the confinement, is not one of you. It is not Sir Reginald. It is not a ghost. And it is not a stranger. It is someone who has been in this room every evening, who has poured your wine and cleared your plates and listened to every word you have spoken, and whom not one of you has looked at twice. He paused. It is the housekeeper. The silence that followed was not the silence of surprise. It was the silence of recognition, the terrible clarifying silence of people who have just been told something they already knew, but had not permitted themselves to see. Mrs. Lockhart closed her eyes. Cross's hand tightened on the leather case. Whitfield's jaw worked as though he were chewing on something he could not swallow. "But I do not yet have the final piece," Holmes continued. "The documents, the original fraudulent papers that would prove Daniel Ferris did not act alone. Without them, this is accusation. With them, it is evidence." He turned to Leonard Cross. "Mr. Cross." Cross did not move. His eyes were fixed on Holmes with the flat, unblinking attention of a man who has been expecting this moment for a very long time and has exhausted every strategy for avoiding it. "You have carried that case with you since the moment you arrived," Holmes said. "You have not let it leave your side. You have not let it leave your sight. You brought it to dinner. You brought it to breakfast. You slept with it beside your bed. That is not the behaviour of a man protecting professional papers. That is the behaviour of a man carrying the only evidence that connects him to a crime he has spent 5 years believing would never be discovered." Cross said nothing. "Open the case, Mr. Cross." "I will not." "You will. Because if you do not, I will ensure that the police open it for you, and the circumstances of that opening will be considerably less dignified than this one." Cross looked around the room. He looked at Whitfield, who turned away. He looked at Mrs. Lockhart, who did not meet his eyes. He looked at Kemp, who stared at the floor. He looked at Hartwell, who was weeping silently into his hands. He looked at Miss Price, who was watching him with an expression of such raw and unguarded anguish that it was painful to witness. He looked at the leather case on his knees. Then, with the slow, deliberate movements of a man performing his own autopsy, he unfastened the clasp. Inside the case, arranged in precise order between sheets of tissue paper, were documents, dozens of them. Transfer orders, account ledgers, legal memoranda, correspondence, all dated from the period of the Whitmore maritime fraud, all bearing signatures and initials that did not belong to Daniel Ferris. I saw Cross's own name on several. I saw Kemp's. I saw references to Whitfield's naval supply accounts and Hartwell's medical authorizations. I saw a draft of a legal instrument that had been designed to make theft look like investment, and I saw the precision with which it had been constructed, and I understood why Holmes had called it architecture. These were the documents that should have been presented at Ferris's trial. These were the documents that would have revealed the conspiracy. These were the documents that Cross had kept, not out of sentiment, not out of carelessness, but because a solicitor's deepest instinct is to retain proof, even proof of his own guilt, because proof is power, and its absence is vulnerability. He had kept them as insurance against the others, against the day when the conspiracy might fracture and each participant might need leverage against the rest. He had never imagined they would be demanded by Sherlock Holmes in a drawing room at 3 o'clock in the morning, while the sea breathed against the cliffs below and an empty chair waited in the next room. Holmes examined the documents in silence. He moved through them with the swift, practiced attention of a man who understood financial fraud at a structural level, and I watched his face as each page confirmed what Eleanor Ferris had spent 6 months trying to prove. When he finished, He set the case down on the table beside his chair and looked across. "These documents prove that Daniel Ferris was one participant in a conspiracy of 7, he said. "They prove that the fraud was designed by you and executed by Kemp, with the assistance of Hartwell, Whitfield and Miss Price, and with the knowing silence of Mrs. Lockhart. They prove that the evidence presented at Ferris's trial was incomplete, deliberately, systematically and successfully incomplete, and they prove that the man who went to prison and died there bore a punishment that should have been shared among all of you." Cross said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The case lay open on the table like a wound, and the room was full of its contents, and no one could look away. Holmes straightened. "There is one more thing," he said. "The person who assembled this weekend, who manipulated this household, who orchestrated every disturbance and planted every object and confined Aldous Kemp in a cellar with the ghost of the man he betrayed. That person is still in this house, and it is time she was seen." He turned toward the doorway. "Miss Graves," he said, "or should I say, Miss Ferris, I believe you have heard enough to know that the moment you have been waiting for has arrived." The doorway was empty. The corridor beyond was dark. Then from the shadows a figure stepped forward into the firelight, and the housekeeper of Blackthorn House entered the drawing-room for the last time. Chapter 9. The Woman in Plain Sight. She did not hurry. She did not hesitate. She walked into the room with the same measured, unhurried stride with which she had served dinner, and poured coffee and cleared plates for 2 days. And she stood before the fireplace with her hands folded at her waist and her back straight, and her face as still and composed as it had been from the first moment I saw her in the doorway of Blackthorn House. She did not look like a woman who had been caught. She looked like a woman who had been waiting. "My name," she said, "is Eleanor Ferris. Daniel Ferris was my brother. He died in Dartmoor prison 8 months ago of pneumonia contracted during forced outdoor labour in conditions that would not have been tolerated for livestock. He was 31 years old. He had served 4 years and 7 months of a sentence that should have been shared among 7 people. He served it alone because the 6 of you ensured that he would, and because Mr. Holmes—" She turned to Holmes. Her eyes met his without hostility, without accusation, and without the theatrical fury that I had expected. What I saw in them instead was something far more difficult to confront, a calm, exhaustive precision that matched Holmes's own. Because Mr. Holmes solved the case with characteristic brilliance and never once questioned why it solved so easily. Holmes did not flinch. He held her gaze and said nothing, and in his silence I heard something I had never heard from him before. Not agreement exactly, but the absence of denial. He did not defend himself. He did not explain. He simply stood and received it. Eleanor Ferris turned back to the room. "I did not come here to harm anyone. I have not harmed anyone. Mr. Kemp was confined, not injured. He was given water, blankets, and a candle. He was given something far more important than comfort. He was given the truth. I read aloud in the words of the man he betrayed. If that caused him suffering, it is because the truth is sometimes a suffering thing, and he had been hiding from it for 5 years." She paused. Her voice had not wavered. Her hands had not moved. She stood before 6 people who had destroyed her brother and 1 who had failed to save him, and she spoke with the terrible steadiness of someone who had rehearsed this moment, not in words but in years, years of grief refined into discipline, years of rage compressed into purpose, years of silence sharpened into the instrument now being wielded in this room. "I will tell you what each of you did," she said, "not because you do not know, but because you have never been made to hear it spoken aloud in the presence of others." She turned to Kemp first. "Aldous Kemp. You were Daniel's superior at the Whitmore Maritime Company. You recruited him into the scheme. You showed him which ledgers to alter, which entries to falsify, which dates to use. You told him the risk was negligible and the reward was certain. And when the investigation began, you ensured that every trail led to him and every exit led away from you. You were the architect. He was the foundation you built on and then buried. Kemp did not raise his head. He sat in his chair with his hands between his knees and his shoulders drawn in, and his eyes fixed on the floor, and he did not speak. She turned to Cross. "Leonard Cross, you drafted the legal instruments that disguised the theft as legitimate investment transfers. Your expertise made the fraud possible, and your precision made it invisible. When the investigation began, you ensured that the documents bearing your involvement were removed from the files that Mr. Holmes examined. The originals you kept, not out of guilt, but out of professional habit. You kept them because a solicitor never destroys leverage, even when that leverage is evidence of his own crime." Cross sat rigid in his chair. His hands had fallen from the leather case and lay flat on his thighs, and his face was the face of a man watching a structure he had spent years building, being dismantled with the same tools he had used to build it. She turned to Hartwell. "Dr. Philip Hartwell, you were the company physician. Your medical authority granted access to restricted offices after hours, access that was essential to the scheme. You signed the authorizations, you were paid for your signatures, and the money you received funded a dependency that you have never escaped and that has been destroying you as surely as prison destroyed my brother, though more slowly and with less honesty." Hartwell wept. He did not try to hide it. The tears ran down his grey face and fell onto his trembling hands, and he made no sound at all, and his silence was worse than any cry. She turned to Whitfield. "Captain James Whitfield, your naval supply channels were used to move the stolen funds beyond the reach of ordinary audit. Your reputation as an officer of impeccable honour provided the conspiracy with its most valuable asset, respectability. You did not dirty your hands with ledgers or forgeries. You simply allowed your name and your rank to be used as a laundry, and you accepted your share of the proceeds with the understanding that a gentleman's involvement in financial crime is, by definition, invisible." Whitfield's jaw was clenched so tightly that I could see the muscles standing out beneath the skin of his cheeks. He did not speak. He did not move. But his eyes, fixed on Eleanor Ferris, held something I had not seen in them before. Not anger, not defiance, but the bleak recognition of a man who has just heard the truth about himself, spoken in a voice he cannot dismiss. She turned to Miss Price. "Adeline Price, you were 24 years old. You were a junior secretary. You were in love with Aldous Kemp, who used that love as efficiently as he used everything else. He told you to destroy the correspondence between himself and the other conspirators. He told you the letters were unimportant. He told you it was a small thing, a nothing, a favour between people who cared for each other. And you did it. You burned the only documents that would have proved my brother's claims of a wider conspiracy. You were young, and you were frightened, and you were manipulated, but the letters burned just the same." Miss Price was crying. She had been crying since Eleanor began to speak, silently and steadily, her hands pressed against her mouth as though trying to hold something inside that had been fighting to escape for years. "I know," Eleanor said, and for the first time her voice softened, not into forgiveness, but into recognition. "I know you did not understand what you were doing, but understanding does not undo it. My brother wrote 7 letters from prison to the man who coached him, begging for someone to tell the truth. Those letters were never answered, and the letters you burned were the reason no one else could tell it for him." She turned finally to Mrs. Lockhart. "Virginia Lockhart, you discovered, after your husband's death, that part of the stolen pension money had funded your son's treatment at a sanatorium in Switzerland. You could have come forward. You could have contacted the authorities. You could have written a single letter to the court that convicted my brother. Instead, you chose silence, and you have spent the years since then building a monument of public charity so large and so visible that you hoped no one would ever think to look at what it was built upon." Mrs. Lockhart opened her eyes. She had kept them closed throughout Eleanor's account, and when she opened them they were dry and clear, and held an expression of such complicated anguish that I found myself looking away. "My son would have died," she said quietly. "Yes," Eleanor said, "and my brother did die. Those are both true. I do not ask you to choose between them. I ask you only to stop pretending that the choice was not made." The room was silent. The fire crackled. The sea moved against the cliffs in its long, indifferent rhythm. 6 people sat in a drawing room in a house full of salvaged wreckage and heard, for the first time, the complete architecture of their shared guilt spoken aloud by the sister of the man they had collectively destroyed. Eleanor Ferris turned to Holmes. "Mr. Holmes, I did not bring you here to solve a mystery. There is no mystery. The crime is known. The criminals are present. The evidence is in Mr. Cross's case. I brought you here because 5 years ago you were the instrument of my brother's conviction, and I needed you to see what your certainty cost. I needed you to sit in this room and look at these people and understand that the case you solved was not the crime that was committed." She paused. "And I needed you to judge. Not them. They will be judged by courts and by their own consciences, which are already doing more damage than any sentence could. I needed you to judge yourself, to ask whether the man who solved the Whitmore Maritime case with such elegant precision ever considered, even for a moment, that elegance is not the same as completeness." Holmes stood very still. The firelight moved across his face, and I searched it for the signs I knew. The tightening of the jaw that meant anger, the narrowing of the eyes that meant calculation, the faint lift of the chin that meant he had found his footing and was preparing to speak from a position of strength. I saw none of them. What I saw was a man standing in the presence of a truth. He had no mechanism to deflect, because the mechanism he would normally have used, his intellect, his precision, his certainty, was exactly what had failed. "Miss Ferris," he said, "you are correct." 3 words, no qualification, no defense, no elaborate construction of mitigating circumstances or professional justifications. He said it the way he said everything that mattered, simply, directly, and without ornament. "The case was too clean," he continued. "I knew it at the time, though I did not permit myself to act on that knowledge. Neatness flattered me. Certainty rewarded me. And a man went to prison carrying a punishment he should have shared with 6 others, because I accepted the evidence I was given instead of questioning why it had been given so easily." He looked at the room, at the 6 faces arranged before him, each bearing its own particular expression of collapse. "The case will be reopened," he said. "The documents in Mr. Cross's case will be submitted to Scotland Yard. The conviction of Daniel Ferris will be reviewed in light of evidence that should have been available at the original trial, and each of you will answer for the role you played, not to me and not to Miss Ferris, but to the law." He paused. "That is the judgment you asked me to deliver, Miss Ferris. I deliver it now. Your brother was guilty, but he was not guilty alone. And the record will be corrected." Eleanor Ferris received this without visible emotion. Her face did not change. Her hands did not move. But something shifted behind her eyes. A release, perhaps, or the first tremor of an exhaustion she had been holding at bay for months or years. She had carried this weight across 6 months of deception, across countless evenings of pouring wine and clearing plates and listening to the casual conversation of the people who had destroyed her brother, and now the weight had been set down, and the absence of it was written in her face as clearly as grief. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes," she said. "Do not thank me," Holmes replied. "What you have done tonight was necessary, but it was also illegal and dangerous and conducted outside every boundary of lawful procedure. You have infiltrated a household under a false identity. You have unlawfully confined a man. You have manipulated vulnerable individuals through psychological coercion. These are crimes, Miss Ferris, regardless of the justice they serve." "I know," she said. "Then you know that I cannot protect you from the consequences." "I did not ask you to protect me. I asked you to see. Holmes was silent for a moment. "I see," he said. "I see it all. And I wish I had seen it 5 years ago." Chapter 10. The Judgment of the Living. The hours that followed were the quietest and most terrible I have ever spent in the company of Sherlock Holmes. The fire burned low and was rebuilt and burned low again. Dawn came slowly to the windows of the drawing-room. First a thinning of the darkness, then a grey half-light that turned the glass to pewter, then the full, pallid morning of a coastal autumn, colourless and cold. No one had slept. No one had left the room. The 6 guilty sat in their separate chairs like figures in a painting of a trial that had already been decided, waiting not for a verdict but for the formalities that would give their ruin its proper shape. Holmes had spent the remaining hours of the night at the writing desk in the corner of the room, working through Cross's documents with the methodical intensity of a man rebuilding a structure he had once believed complete. He sorted them into categories: financial, legal, medical, military, and cross-referenced each one against his own memory of the original investigation. Occasionally he asked a question of one of the guests, and each time the answer came without resistance, as though the will to conceal had been exhausted, and what remained was only the bleak relief of no longer carrying the weight. Cross was the first to speak at length. He did so with the precise, emotionless diction of a man giving a legal deposition, which in a sense he was. He described how he had drafted the fraudulent transfer instruments, how he had structured them to mimic legitimate investment movements, how he had ensured that the documents presented to Holmes during the original investigation bore only Ferris's name and initials. He spoke for perhaps 20 minutes. When he finished, he closed his leather case for the last time and set it on the floor beside his chair with the finality of a man surrendering a weapon. Kemp's confession was longer and more painful. He spoke haltingly with frequent pauses during which he stared at his hands as though they belonged to someone else. He described how he had identified Ferris as a suitable instrument, young, eager to please, trusting of authority, and how he had drawn him into the scheme incrementally, beginning with small irregularities and escalating over months until Ferris was too deeply implicated to withdraw. He described the moment when the investigation began and the decision was made, collectively he insisted, though it was clear he had been its driving force, to ensure that every visible thread led to Ferris alone. "He came to me," Kemp said, his voice cracking, "the night before the police arrested him. He came to my lodgings and asked me what was happening, and I told him it would be all right. And I told him to stay calm and answer their questions and that the matter would be resolved. I looked him in the eye and I lied to him. And the next morning they took him away, and I went to my office and I worked a full day as though nothing had happened." Hartwell confessed next. His account was shorter and more broken. He admitted that his medical signatures had given the conspirators access to restricted company offices after regular hours, access that was essential for altering the ledgers without detection. He admitted that he had been paid for his cooperation. He admitted that the payment had fed a morphine dependency that had begun 3 years before the fraud and had never abated. "I was not brave enough to refuse and not strong enough to live with what I had done," he said. "So I found a way to stop feeling it, and I have been finding that way every day since. Watson in me, the physician, the man who had treated dependency in hospital wards and military camps, wanted to offer comfort. But this was not the moment for comfort. This was the moment for truth, and truth is not always kind." Mrs. Lockhart spoke with the careful composure of a woman who had spent years constructing a public self and was now watching it dismantle. She confirmed that she had discovered after her husband's death that a portion of the stolen pension funds had been used to finance her son's treatment at a Swiss sanatorium. The treatment had saved his life. The money that paid for it had been stolen from retired dock workers, men who had spent their lives hauling cargo and coiling rope and were owed a modest security in their final years. "I could not give the money back without revealing where it had come from," she said. "And I could not reveal where it had come from without destroying my son's reputation and my own. So I stayed silent. and I have spent every year since trying to return what was taken, not to the men it was taken from, because I did not know their names, but to the world. Every hospital subscription, every school fund, every charitable board I've joined, it was all repayment. It was never enough. I knew it was never enough. Miss Price's confession was the briefest and the most devastating. She sat in her chair by the window and spoke in a voice so quiet that I had to lean forward to hear her. "He asked me to burn the letters," she said. "Aldous. He said they were old correspondence, nothing important, just clutter. I loved him, and I would have done anything he asked, so I burned them. 17 letters. I burned them in the grate of my office and swept out the ashes and went home and made my tea and did not think about it again until Daniel Ferris's trial, when his barrister stood up in court and said that his client claimed there was correspondence proving a wider conspiracy and that this correspondence had disappeared." She stopped. She pressed her hands against her face. "I sat in the public gallery and I heard that, and I knew what I had done, and I've never stopped knowing." Whitfield was the last. He did not confess. He did not speak at all. He stood by the mantelpiece with his arms folded, and his face set in the rigid, unyielding expression of a man who would rather be court-martialed than humiliated. And he refused every invitation, from Holmes, from Eleanor, from the silent pressure of the room itself, to add his voice to the account. It did not matter. The documents in Cross's case named him. The naval transfer receipts bore his authorization. The money had moved through channels he controlled. His silence was not a defense. It was a monument, and like all monuments to pride, it convinced no one and protected nothing. Holmes completed his review of the documents shortly after 7 in the morning. He gathered them into a single bundle, tied them with string from Sir Reginald's desk, and placed them in the leather case from which they had come. "These will be delivered to Scotland Yard today," he said. "I will prepare a full account of the original investigation and its deficiencies, and I will recommend that the conviction of Daniel Ferris be reviewed. The process will not be swift. The law does not correct itself easily or willingly, and the men who prosecuted Ferris will not welcome the suggestion that their case was incomplete. But the evidence is unambiguous, and I will ensure that it is heard." He turned to Eleanor Ferris, who had remained standing by the doorway throughout the night, watching the confessions with the still, exhaustive attention of a woman witnessing the fulfillment of something she had laboured toward for longer than anyone in the room could fully comprehend. "Miss Ferris," Holmes said, "the matter of your own conduct remains." "I am aware," she said. "You have committed acts that are, by any legal measure, criminal. False identity, unlawful confinement, psychological manipulation, conspiracy to pervert the course of—" "No," he stopped himself. "That is not quite right. You have not perverted the course of justice. You have, by extraordinary and unlawful means, restored it. That does not make your actions legal, but it makes them difficult to condemn without reservation." He was silent for a moment. The room waited. "I will include in my report to Scotland Yard a full account of your actions and your motives. I will note that no physical harm was inflicted on any person. I will note that the information you uncovered is genuine and that the case it supports is sound. And I will note that the original investigation, my investigation, failed to uncover evidence that a more thorough examination would have revealed, and that your intervention, however irregular, has corrected an injustice that should not have been allowed to stand." He paused. "What the authorities choose to do with that information is beyond my control, but I will not be the instrument of your destruction, Miss Ferris. I have already been the instrument of your brother's, and I do not intend to repeat the error." Eleanor Ferris looked at him for a long time. Her face did not change, her composure did not waver, but something in her eyes, something deep and long-held and fiercely guarded, softened, not into gratitude, but into something rarer and more painful. Recognition. The recognition of one precise mind by another, across a gulf of suffering that precision alone could not bridge. "My brother was a good man, Mr. Holmes," she said. "He was not perfect. He was weak where he should have been strong, and trusting where he should have been cautious. But he was good, and he deserved better than to die in a prison cell with no one believing him." "He did," Holmes said, "and I am sorry that I was among those who did not believe." She nodded. Once. Then she removed the housekeeper's apron she had worn for 6 months, folded it with the same care and precision she had brought to every task in this house, and laid it on the sideboard beside the empty decanter. "I will wait in the kitchen for whatever comes next," she said. "I have nowhere else to be." She left the room. The doorway held her absence for a moment, and then it was just a doorway again, and the drawing-room held only the guilty and the witnesses and the long grey light of a morning that offered no comfort. Sir Reginald, who had sat through the entire night in a state of stunned and silent bewilderment, finally spoke. "Holmes," he said, "what do I do now?" Holmes looked at him, this kind, vain, nearly bankrupt man who had been used as a stage for someone else's justice, and had borne it with more dignity than he knew. "You continue, Sir Reginald. You tend your collection. You preserve what has been salvaged. That is what this house has always done." We left Blackthorn House that afternoon. A wire had been sent to Scotland Yard, and Holmes carried Cross's leather case under his arm with the gravity of a man transporting something that could not be replaced. The carriage took us back along the same road we had travelled 2 days earlier, through the same low hills and dense copses of elm, past the same chalk downs rolling toward the coast. Holmes did not speak. He sat with his head turned toward the window and his eyes fixed on the landscape passing, and his silence was not the charged, productive silence of a mind at work, but the heavy, inward silence of a man in the presence of something he could not deduce or analyse or file away. It was the silence of reckoning. On the train from Worthing, as the Sussex countryside gave way to the grey sprawl of London, I asked him the only question I had left. "Will you be all right, Holmes?" He did not answer immediately. He watched the suburbs emerge from the fields, the first terraces, the first factory chimneys, the first church spires rising above the rooftops like fingers pointing at an empty sky. "I will be accurate, Watson," he said at last, "which is the only form of all right that I have ever trusted." We reached Baker Street as the evening lamps were being lit. Mrs. Hudson had left a cold supper and a fire, and the sitting-room was warm and familiar and unchanged, the violin on its hook, the correspondence pinned to the mantelpiece with a jackknife, the chemical apparatus on the side table, the 2 armchairs drawn up before the hearth in their usual positions. Holmes set Cross's leather case on the desk. He removed his coat. He stood before the fire for a long time with one hand on the mantelpiece, looking down into the flames. He did not sit as a conqueror. He sat, at last, as a man in the presence of an absence, the empty chair of Daniel Ferris, which, once seen, could never again be forgotten.